What if the first night with a millionaire changed everything forever? On their honeymoon, he whispered something that made her heart tremble. And what happened next left everyone speechless. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to know how this incredible story ended, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Because what comes next will surprise you. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the prisons that prevent us from being free. Emily's heart was beating so hard, it seemed to echo against the walls of the most luxurious hotel suite she had ever seen in her 23 years of life. Her nervous fingers played with the belt of the Italian silk robe that cost more than 6 months of her salary as a rural teacher. Just 8 hours ago, she had walked down the aisle of one of the most impressive cathedrals in New York City, before 300 guests she barely knew, to join her life with that of a complete stranger. The full-length mirror reflected the image of a frightened young woman with green eyes dilated by fear and cheeks flushed with anxiety. How had she ended up here? Images flashed through her mind like fragments of a movie that seemed to star someone else. Her father crying in the family kitchen while holding the bank letter, the family apple orchard in Virginia withering after 3 years of severe drought, the unexpected visit from that impeccably dressed lawyer with a proposal that sounded like a fairy tale from another century. Michael Anderson, 45, owner of a business empire based in New York City, needed a wife to appease his shareholders and improve his public image as a workaholic loner. She needed to save her family from ruin. The agreement seemed as simple and cold as a business contract. When the bedroom door opened, Emily closed her eyes tightly, like a child who believes she can become invisible in the face of danger. But instead of the firm, determined footsteps she expected, she heard a soft whisper that caught her off guard. "I promise to be respectful. There's no rush for anything. We can simply talk tonight if you prefer." She slowly opened her eyes and met Michael's tired gaze. For the first time, she noticed that behind the businessman's imposing appearance, there was a loneliness that resonated with her own. He wasn't the predator she had imagined, but a man who seemed as lost as she was in this theater of appearances. What could two strangers who just married for convenience possibly talk about, she asked, surprised by her own courage. He approached the window and contemplated the lights of New York City, the metropolis that stretched beneath them like a sea of artificial stars. "About who we were before we became this," he answered, gesturing to himself with a self-deprecating motion she hadn't expected. "About who we want to be tomorrow." And so, on that first night in the hotel with a view of the city skyline, Emily discovered that even the coldest agreements can sometimes contain the seeds of something unexpectedly warm. Michael's mansion on the Upper East Side was exactly as Emily had imagined it, a temple of marble, glass and solitude, with views of Central Park. The spacious, minimalist rooms seemed designed to impress, not to live in. The gleaming floors echoed her steps like a constant reproach, reminding her that she was an intruder in this realm of sterile luxury. During those first weeks, Emily walked through the corridors with the caution of someone treading a minefield. The staff observed her with a mixture of curiosity and barely disguised compassion. She had heard their whispers. "She won't last. She's just another of his eccentricities. Poor thing, she has no idea what she's gotten herself into." It was true. She had no idea, but she was determined to survive. On her first morning in the mansion, Emily woke at dawn, as she had done all her life on the small family farm. She dressed simply, ignoring the closet full of designer clothes that Michael had ordered for her. In the immaculate kitchen, where everything seemed brand new, she prepared coffee, strong the way her grandfather had taught her to make it. Mrs. Parker, the housekeeper, found her there, and her expression of astonishment was almost comical. "Ma'am, there's no need for you to. We take care of everything." "I like to make my own coffee," Emily replied with a shy smile. "And please call me Emily." The older woman looked at her as if she had just suggested something completely absurd. "Mr. Anderson never has breakfast at home. He leaves very early and doesn't return until evening," she informed her in a tone that suggested this knowledge was fundamental to surviving in that house. However, at 9 o'clock sharp, while Emily was contemplating the city from the terrace, the door opened and Michael appeared. He wore an impeccable suit, but there was something different in his expression, a vulnerability he didn't show in public. "Good morning," he said, pausing as if he wasn't sure of being welcome on his own terrace. "Good morning," she answered, offering him a cup of coffee. I wasn't sure if you liked it black or with cream. Black, very strong, he replied, surprised by the gesture. Like my grandfather Thomas, she smiled for the first time since the wedding. He used to say coffee should be black as night, hot as hell and strong as love. Michael took the cup, and their fingers brushed for an instant. An invisible current ran through the space between them. I never have breakfast at home, he confessed, as if he were breaking some unwritten rule. There's always a first time, she responded with a simplicity that was disarming. That first shared breakfast, with views of Central Park, became a daily ritual that profoundly disconcerted the staff. Mrs. Parker, who had been in Michael's service for 15 years, commented to the cook in a tone that mixed surprise and something akin to hope. In all these years, I've never seen him have breakfast at home. I didn't even know he liked toast with jam. Emily learned to prepare coffee exactly how he liked it, a double espresso with a touch of cinnamon that he would never publicly admit to enjoying. Michael, for his part, began to arrive punctually at 9 every morning, as if those 30 minutes of conversation about everyday things were the most important meeting on his agenda. It was during one of those breakfasts that Michael casually mentioned the Sunday family dinner. My mother expects to meet you. The family dinner is a tradition, he said, in a tone that suggested more of a warning than an invitation. Emily felt a knot form in her throat. She had heard enough about Mrs. Elizabeth Anderson, the matriarch of the family, a woman of New York high society known for her relentless defense of traditions and her critical eye. Should I wear something special? She asked, trying not to let her voice betray her anxiety. Michael looked at her with an intensity that made her blush. Be yourself, Emily. There are already enough masks at those dinners. But they both knew that this would be the first of many difficult tests she would have to face. Mrs. Anderson's mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, made Michael's house seem modest in comparison. A neoclassical estate, preserved with meticulous detail and decorated like a museum from another era. Emily felt that every object, from the silver candelabras to the paintings by recognized artists, observed her with disdain, judging her presence as an anomaly in this sanctuary of inherited privilege. Michael gently squeezed her hand before the imposing oak door opened, revealing a butler in livery who received them with a formal bow. "Remember what I told you," he whispered. "They're just people with too much free time to criticize others." Emily nodded, grateful for the gesture, but the knot in her stomach tightened even more when they entered the main hall, 6 pairs of eyes fixed on her like precise darts. Mrs. Anderson approached with the studied elegance of someone who has turned every movement into a statement of superiority. At 70, she maintained an icy beauty that time seemed to respect for fear of contradicting her. "So this is the young teacher," she said, examining her from head to toe with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to the family, dear." The next 3 hours were an elegantly disguised ordeal of a Sunday lunch. Between courses, seemingly innocent questions hid small traps. "Does your family have any New England roots?" asked one of Michael's aunts. "No, ma'am. We're from Virginia for generations," Emily responded honestly. "Ah, Southerners," the woman replied as if she had confessed to some venial sin. "I suppose that explains the accent." "A charming accent, if I may say so," Michael interjected with a firmness that surprised everyone at the table. During dessert, served on the terrace overlooking the impeccable garden, the conversation turned to the topic Emily most feared. "Michael is no longer that young," Mrs. Anderson commented, stirring her coffee meticulously. "The Andersons have always had at least 2 heirs to ensure the family legacy. I hope you're thinking of giving him a child soon." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. Michael visibly tensed beside her. "Mother, those are matters that only concern Emily and me," he responded with a controlled voice that barely concealed his irritation. "Of course they concern you, son, as they also concern the entire family, the continuity of the surname and the patrimony." The woman insisted without altering her sweetly venomous tone. "I'm simply concerned that time is passing. Women from the countryside tend to be more fertile. It would be a shame not to take advantage of that." Emily had never felt such humiliation. Words caught in her throat as her cheeks burned. However, when she spoke, her voice sounded surprisingly clear. "With all due respect, ma'am, I believe that in the 21st century, children should be the fruit of love, not obligation. When Michael and I decide to form a family, It will be for the right reasons, not to satisfy others' expectations. A sepulchral silence fell over the terrace. Michael looked at her with a mixture of astonishment and something that seemed like admiration. Mrs. Anderson, for the first time, was left speechless for a few seconds. "I see you have character, girl," she finally said, with a smile that promised nothing good. "Interesting choice, Michael." The journey back home passed in tense silence. Emily looked out the car window, with unshed tears clouding her vision. When they arrived at the mansion, she went directly to her room and locked herself in the bathroom. Only there, under the sound of the shower, did she allow herself to cry. 2 hours later, she heard soft knocks on the door. "Emily, may I come in?" Michael's voice sounded concerned. She opened the door with reddened eyes and damp hair. He was still wearing his lunch clothes, his tie loosened, and an expression she had never seen before. "My mother has no right to make you feel that way," he said firmly. "I'm going to establish clear boundaries. This is between us, no one else." That night, sitting on the bedroom floor with 2 cups of chamomile tea, they really talked for the first time since their wedding. Not about trivialities, not about practical arrangements, but about fears and expectations. "Why me, Michael?" she finally asked. "You could have chosen any woman from your circle." He remained silent for a few moments, as if searching for the exact words. "Because when I saw you teaching those children at your rural school, with that passion and that authenticity," he paused, "I knew you were real. And in my world, Emily, that's the scarcest and most valuable asset." Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Emily had established a routine that gave her a sense of normalcy in this world of luxury and appearances. The mornings were for shared breakfasts with Michael, a space of growing intimacy, where conversations flowed with increasing naturalness. In the afternoons, when he immersed himself in his business obligations, she explored New York, discovering corners of the city that would never appear in tourist guides. On a rainy April afternoon, while observing the abandoned backyard from her bedroom window, Emily had an idea. That forgotten space, invaded by weeds and neglect, could be transformed into something special. When Michael returned that night, earlier than usual due to a last-minute cancellation, she gathered the courage to propose her project. "Would you mind if I reclaimed the backyard?" she asked while they dined in the dining room, too large for 2 people. "It's completely abandoned and could be a beautiful space." Michael looked at her with curiosity. It was the first time she had expressed a desire to change something in the house. "Do you know about gardening?" he asked, genuinely interested. "My grandfather taught me everything about plants when I was little," she replied, cheering up at the memory of those moments. "We had a vegetable garden next to the orchard. It wasn't much, but to me it was magical." Something softened in Michael's usually serious expression. "Make it yours," he said simply. "The house needs life." The following Saturday, Emily woke at dawn, eager to start her project. Dressed in old jeans and a worn t-shirt, she was in the garden, assessing the work ahead, when a voice startled her. "Need help?" Michael was at the garden door, dressed so informally she hardly recognized him. Jeans and a simple t-shirt replaced the impeccable suit that was his second skin. "You? Helping me dig?" Emily couldn't suppress an incredulous smile. "Is that so hard to imagine?" he replied, approaching. "I was a child once too, although my mother did everything possible to turn me into a premature adult." They worked together all morning under the spring sun of New York. Emily was surprised to discover that, beneath the facade of the successful businessman, was a man who enjoyed physical work and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Michael, for his part, watched fascinated as she treated each plant, each piece of earth, with almost reverential respect. "You talk to them," he commented when he heard her whisper to a rose bush she had discovered under the weeds. "Plants listen," she replied, without a hint of embarrassment. "My grandmother Grace used to say a garden thrives when it feels it's loved." By lunchtime, they were both exhausted and covered in dirt, but the garden was beginning to show the first signs of transformation. They sat on the stone steps, sharing a bottle of water and the simple pleasure of fatigue after a job well done. "I have blisters," he confessed, looking at his palms with childlike surprise. "I don't remember the last time I had blisters." Emily took his hands without thinking, examining the red marks with tenderness. His fingers, usually cold and controlled over documents and contracts, were warm and alive. "The price of doing something real," she said. and their gazes met in a moment of connection that neither was prepared to process. Michael gently withdrew his hands, but something had changed between them, a crack in the invisible wall they had built. The following weeks saw not only the garden flourish but also a new dynamic between them. The outdoor space became a shared refuge. Emily discovered that Michael went there when he returned, particularly stressed from work, pulling weeds with an intensity that revealed his frustrations better than any conversation. One night, after an especially complicated day, she found him in the garden despite the late hour. The moonlight illuminated his tense profile as he contemplated the small pond they had restored together. "Bad day?" she asked, offering him a cup of chamomile tea. "The worst ones are those that seem perfect on the outside," he replied enigmatically. "Today, I closed a deal that will greatly benefit the company. Everyone congratulated me. No one knows that to achieve it I had to compromise certain principles." The confession caught her by surprise. It was the first time he had shared something so personal, so vulnerable. "Sometimes difficult decisions define us more than easy ones," she said softly. Michael looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, marveling at the simple wisdom of her words. "You know what's strangest, Emily, that before knowing you I didn't even question these things. The end justified the means always. Now I wonder, what would you think?" That night they talked until the sky began to lighten. Not as a marriage of convenience, not as two strangers united by a contract, but as two people who were beginning to truly see each other through the cracks in the walls they had both built to protect themselves. The invitation arrived in a thick paper envelope with the Anderson Enterprises logo, a crucial meeting in San Francisco with potential investors for a new project. What was extraordinary wasn't the meeting itself, but Michael's handwritten note in the margin, "I'd like you to come with me." Emily reread those words several times, not fully understanding their meaning. Was it part of the marital facade, a strategy to impress investors, or was there something more to this invitation? When she asked Michael during breakfast, his response disconcerted her even more. "It's not an obligation, it's a wish," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "I'd like you to accompany me, but I'll understand if you prefer not to." There was a vulnerability in his request that Emily hadn't seen before. It wasn't an order disguised as a suggestion, as often happened in his corporate world. It was a genuine invitation. "I'll go," she replied, surprised by her own decision. The private flight to San Francisco was a surreal experience. As the flight attendant served them champagne in crystal flutes, Emily couldn't help thinking about the journeys of her childhood. Hours squeezed into the rural bus to visit relatives in Richmond, singing songs with her younger brother to pass the time. What would that child she once was think if she could see her now? Michael observed her with curiosity. "What are you thinking about? You seem thousands of miles away." "About how strange life is," she answered honestly. "About how the paths we never imagined taking sometimes lead us to places we never dreamed of." He nodded, understanding more than she thought. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had made different decisions," he confessed quietly. "If I had had the courage to contradict my father when he forced me to study business instead of architecture, which was what really passionate me." "You wanted to be an architect?" Emily sat up, genuinely surprised by this revelation. "I was good at drawing. I designed buildings since I was a child," he smiled nostalgically. "My room was full of plans and sketches. My father threw them all away when I turned 18. Andersons build empires, not little houses," he said. Emily felt a pang of pain for that young man, whose dreams had been so cruelly dismissed. "It's never too late, Michael. You could take it up again as a hobby." He looked at her with a mixture of surprise and something akin to hope. "You know, you're the first person I've told this to in 20 years. The meeting in San Francisco was a resounding success. The project, a sustainable energy initiative that could transform the American West, received unanimous support from investors." Emily observed Michael in his element, confident, persuasive, brilliant. But now she saw something more. The moments when his gaze sought hers in the crowd, as if he needed an anchor amid that sea of ambitions and egos. When everyone expected the usual celebration, expensive champagne and dinner at some Michelin-starred restaurant, Michael surprised everyone, including Emily. "My wife and I have other plans tonight," he announced, ignoring the incredulous looks from his partners. We'll celebrate in our own way." Instead of heading to the tourist area, the car took them to a popular neighborhood in the Mission District. Michael led her through narrow streets until stopping in front of a small cafe with a facade of faded tiles. "I want you to know who I was before I became this," he said, gesturing to himself self-deprecatingly. The cafe smelled of fresh bread, homemade pie, and artisanal coffee. The owner, an older man with a stained apron, recognized Michael instantly and embraced him with genuine affection. "Mike, how many years, son?" he exclaimed, patting his back. "I thought you'd forgotten old Joe." Emily watched this exchange, fascinated. This was a completely different Michael than the one she knew, relaxed, smiling, without a trace of the habitual tension he carried on his shoulders. During dinner, simple but delicious, Michael told her about his life as a young intern in San Francisco. The months in a tiny apartment near the marina, eating sandwiches and saving every extra dollar to invest in books and courses. The constant fear of failure, of disappointing his father, of not being enough. "I came here every Friday," he said, savoring the apple pie nostalgically. "It was my only luxury. Joe would let me stay for hours while I studied, with just one coffee that I'd make last all afternoon." For the first time, Emily saw completely the man behind the corporate armor. His hands trembled slightly as he held the mug, and she, in an instinctive gesture, covered his fingers with hers. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she whispered. "Thank you for wanting to see it," he replied, intertwining his fingers with hers. That night, as they walked along the waterfront under the Californian moon, something fundamental changed between them. There were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, just a complicit silence and the natural swinging of their joined hands, as if they had always been destined to find each other. The return to New York brought with it a new tension, electrifying and disconcerting. The house, which before had seemed too large for two strangers, now felt surprisingly small for two people who were beginning to gravitate around each other with a force neither dared to name. Emily couldn't sleep. The nights in her solitary room had become endless since San Francisco. She tossed between the sheets, remembering the feeling of Michael's hand intertwined with hers, wondering if he too was awake, on the other side of the hallway. On the third night, after their return, at 2 a.m, she gathered all her courage and went out into the corridor. Her bare feet advanced silently until stopping in front of his door. She took a deep breath and knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. Michael looked at her with a mixture of surprise and something deeper that neither was prepared to name. Could we just sleep in the same room?" she whispered, vulnerability shining in her eyes. "It doesn't have to be anything more, just, I don't want to be alone." In response, he stepped aside, inviting her in. Michael's room was like him, elegant, sober, with unexpected touches of warmth in the small details. A poetry book on the nightstand, an old architectural drawing framed on the wall. They lay down in the wide bed, maintaining a prudent distance that seemed both infinite and insignificant. In the dimness, their breathing found a common rhythm, a dialogue without words. "I've never shared my bed," he confessed in the darkness. "Not like this." "Like what?" she asked, barely audible. "Real," he answered simply, without pretenses, without expectations, just being. Emily extended her hand across the space that separated them and found his, their fingers intertwined, bridging the abyss of solitude that both had inhabited for so long. "Good night, Michael. Good night, Emily." They slept like that, connected by that single point of contact, but it was the deepest and most restorative sleep either had experienced in years. From that night on, something definitely changed in the dynamic of their strange marriage. The facade began to become structure, the rehearsed gestures into natural movements. Emily discovered that Michael had recurring nightmares. He would stir in his dreams, murmuring figures and company names, reliving imaginary failures. She learned to recognize the signs, to take his hand in the darkness, to whisper to him that everything was all right until his breathing calmed. Michael, for his part, noticed that she had a habit of playing with the rosary that her grandmother Grace had given her when she left home to get married. Whenever she was anxious or worried, her fingers automatically sought the worn beads. Without saying anything, he arranged for a jeweler to discreetly reinforce the thread, ensuring it would never break. One morning, while having breakfast in their usual corner of the terrace, Emily casually mentioned her desire to visit her family in Virginia. "It's been almost 8 months since I've seen them," she said with a certain melancholy. "I wonder how little James, my nephew, is doing. When I left, he was barely starting to talk." Michael observed her attentively, noticing the shadow of sadness that crossed her face. "Let's go this weekend," he proposed naturally, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "If that works for you, of course." Emily looked at him in surprise. "You would come with me to Virginia? We're a couple, aren't we?" he replied, with a smile that illuminated his eyes in a way she had never seen before. "Besides, I've never tried that apple pie from your grandmother Grace that you talk about so much." The trip to Virginia was a revelation for both. Michael, accustomed to discreet luxury and controlled environments, found himself immersed in the warm chaos of a large family that welcomed him with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and gradual affection. The family home, modest but impeccable, surrounded by apple orchards that were beginning to recover thanks to the financial help Emily sent regularly, resonated with laughter and overlapping conversations. Emily watched in wonder how Michael transformed in this environment. The rigidity of his shoulders disappeared little by little. His smile became more frequent, more authentic. She found him in the backyard, helping her father repair an old fence, with his sleeves rolled up and a concentrated face. "I never thought I'd see you like this," she commented, offering him a glass of homemade lemonade. "Like what?" he asked, accepting the drink with gratitude. "Happy," she replied simply. "You seem at peace." He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I am," he admitted, for the first time in a long time. That night, while everyone slept, they went out to the orchard bathed by the silvery light of the Virginia moon. The fresh spring air brought aromas of moist earth and wildflowers. They walked in silence until stopping under a century-old apple tree. "My grandfather used to say this tree had seen more history than all the books put together," Emily explained, caressing the gnarled trunk with reverence. "It survived drought, wars, abandonment. It always blooms again." Michael contemplated the tree with new respect, understanding the symbolism. "Like you," he said softly, "uprooted from your land, transplanted to an alien world, and yet you bloom." Emily felt something break inside her, not from pain, but from release. Like a dam yielding and allowing water to flow at last. "Michael, But he silenced her gently, placing a finger on her lips. "Don't say anything yet," he asked. "Some things need time to find the right words." Under that century-old apple tree, silent witness to generations, they embraced for the first time. Not as part of an act for the cameras on their wedding day, but as two human beings who were beginning to understand that the walls they had built to protect themselves were falling, stone by stone, day by day. And although they didn't yet have words to name it, something new was growing between them, as strong and resilient as that old apple tree that refused to die. Summer arrived in New York with a scorching intensity. The days stretched lazily, and the nights brought a warm breeze that barely alleviated the heat accumulated in the city's stones. In Emily's garden, now exuberant and flowering, the plants needed additional watering that she religiously administered at dawn and dusk. It was during one of those dawns that she noticed something strange in Michael. She had been observing him for days, the growing tension in his shoulders, the calls at odd hours, the hushed conversations in his office. That morning, as she watered the roses, she saw him leave hurriedly, even forgetting their shared coffee ritual. "Is everything all right?" she asked, intercepting him at the door. "Work matters," he responded curtly, avoiding her gaze. "Don't wait up for dinner." The coldness of his tone hit her like an unexpected slap. During the past months, they had grown accustomed to increasing warmth, to confidences whispered in the darkness, to small gestures of complicity. This sudden distancing deeply disconcerted her. The following days confirmed her fears. Michael returned later and later, his face marked by a concern he refused to share. The abyss they had so laboriously begun to close seemed to open again between them. One night, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Emily waited for him in his office. It was 2 a.m. when the door opened, and Michael entered, surprised to find her sitting in the dimness. "What are you doing awake at this hour?" he asked, loosening his tie with a gesture of infinite weariness. "Waiting for you," she replied simply. "Michael, what's happening? And please, don't tell me it's nothing or that it's just business. I deserve more than that." He looked at her for a long time, as if evaluating something within himself. Finally, With a sigh that seemed to extract all the air from his lungs, he collapsed in the armchair across from her. "The company is in trouble," he confessed in a broken voice. "Mark Wilson, my main partner, has been diverting funds to offshore accounts for months. We discovered it 2 weeks ago, but the damage is already done. Investors are nervous, stocks are falling, and there are rumors of an official investigation." Emily felt the ground move beneath her feet, not because of the financial implications, which she barely understood, but because of the evident pain in Michael's eyes. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked gently, moving closer to him. "Because I was ashamed," he admitted, with a vulnerability he had never shown before. "I could lose everything, Emily. And then, what would be left of me? You would have married a failure." She took his hands in hers, forcing him to look directly at her. "I didn't marry your bank account," she said, with a firmness that surprised them both. "I married the man who plants tomatoes with me on Saturdays. The one who memorizes the stories I tell him about my students. The man who cries watching those old Scorsese films we watch together." Michael looked at her as if he were witnessing a miracle. "Do you mean that?" he asked, his voice a thread. "More seriously than anything else in my life," she replied, and for the first time since they met, it was Emily who took the initiative. She leaned towards him and kissed him. It wasn't the calculated, photogenic kiss of their wedding day, but something real, imperfect and profoundly true. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes. "We'll get through this together," she promised. "We're stronger than you think." And so began the most difficult battle they would face as a couple. Emily surprised Michael with her determination and resourcefulness. She began studying corporate finance at night, reading books and taking online courses to better understand the situation. She used her personal savings, the money he had insisted she keep in a separate account, to hire a specialist attorney recommended by a former professor of hers. "It's our money now," she said when he protested, "and we'll fight together." The following months were an emotional roller coaster of challenges. There were days when the situation seemed to improve, followed by devastating setbacks. Michael had to face the betrayal of someone he considered a friend, the pressure from shareholders, the investigations by regulators. One particularly difficult night, after a disastrous meeting with the main investors, Michael returned home completely defeated. Emily found him in the garden, sitting in the darkness, his head in his hands. "Everything is falling apart," he whispered when she sat beside him. 15 years of work destroyed in months." Emily took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me, Michael Anderson. This is not the end. It's just a storm, and storms always pass. Tomorrow the sun will rise and we'll keep fighting." In that moment, under the starry New York sky, with the scent of roses they had planted together floating in the air, Michael understood a fundamental truth. He had gained something much more valuable than all he could lose. And that certainty, more than any financial strategy, gave him the strength to continue. Emily had become his anchor amid the storm, his constant reminder that there were things more important than material success or social approval. For the first time in his adult life, Michael wasn't alone in the face of adversity. And that simple truth transformed even the darkest days into something bearable. Autumn brought winds of change and increasingly shorter days. Golden leaves fell on the garden they had created together, covering the paths with a crunchy blanket that Emily refused to sweep away, arguing it was part of the natural beauty of the season's cycle. The business crisis had reached a critical point. After months of relentless struggle, endless meetings and sleepless nights, the situation had come to a decisive moment. The board of directors would vote the next day on the restructuring plan proposed by Michael, or approve the sale of the company to a foreign conglomerate. That afternoon, while preparing tea in the kitchen, Emily heard the unmistakable sound of Michael's car in the driveway. It was too early for him to be home, and this simple fact triggered an alarm inside her. She found him in his office, standing by the window, contemplating the garden with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a mixture of absolute defeat and strange calm. "Michael, what happened?" she asked, feeling fear clutch at her throat. He turned slowly toward her. His eyes, usually intense and determined, seemed dimmed, as if something fundamental had been extinguished within him. "It's over," he said in a monotone voice. The board moved up the vote. They accepted the buyout offer. In 24 hours, I'll no longer be the president of the company my father founded, that I turned into an international reference. Emily approached him, trying to process the impact of those words. How is that possible? I thought the vote was tomorrow. A last-minute maneuver, he replied, with a bitter laugh that contained no trace of humor. It seems several board members have been negotiating behind my back for weeks. Even Alexander, my mentor, the man who gave me my first opportunity, voted against my plan. Emily felt anger growing inside her at the injustice of the situation, at the betrayal of those who should have supported Michael. And what happens now? She asked, taking his hands in hers. I'll lose control of the company. I'll retain some shares, enough to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, but nothing comparable to what we had, he explained in a mechanical tone, as if he were reading a financial report and not describing the collapse of his life. The mansion, we'll have to sell it. It's in the company's name. Emily absorbed the news in silence, processing its implications. Then, to Michael's surprise, a small smile appeared on her lips. Is that all? She asked softly. He looked at her, bewildered. All? Emily, I just told you we've lost almost everything. That we'll have to start over, that I've failed you. You haven't failed me, she interrupted firmly. You fought with honor, with integrity. You did everything humanly possible to save the company, and if you didn't succeed, it wasn't for lack of effort or ability, but because of others' betrayal. But our life, everything will change. You won't be able to maintain the lifestyle I've accustomed you to. Emily laughed then, a crystalline laugh that resonated in the room like music. The lifestyle you've accustomed me to? Michael, do you think I care about the jewelry, the luxury cars, or this giant house? She shook her head. I grew up in a house where 6 people shared 2 bedrooms, and they were the happiest years of my life until I found you. She moved closer, taking his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her directly. The only thing that matters to me is that we're together. We can start over. We'll find a smaller house, with space for another garden. I can go back to teaching. You can reinvent yourself, do what really passionate you. Michael gazed at her in wonder, as if witnessing a miracle unfolding before his eyes. You really don't care? He asked in a broken voice. You don't regret marrying me now that I've failed? You haven't failed, Michael. You lost a battle, not the war, she replied, with a serenity that contrasted with the emotional storm he was going through. And no, I don't regret it. In fact, she paused as if gathering courage, I think I fell in love with you precisely because you're the type of man who worries more about failing me than about losing a company. The words hung suspended between them, charged with a meaning that completely transformed the nature of their relationship. It was no longer an agreement, a mutually beneficial contract. It was something much deeper, truer, and paradoxically, more fragile and powerful at the same time. Michael closed his eyes, allowing those words to penetrate him, dissolving the armor of self-demand and perfectionism he had built over decades. I don't deserve your love, he whispered. True love is never about deserving, she answered. It's about choosing day after day. And I choose you, Michael, with a company or without one, rich or ruined. I choose you. That night, embraced in the bed they now shared without pretexts or justifications, Michael cried for the first time since his father's death. They weren't tears of defeat, but of release, as if something old and rigid were breaking inside him to make way for something new, more authentic. Emily held him in silence, caressing his hair, offering the refuge of her unconditional presence. And in that moment of maximum vulnerability, both understood they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into the kind of union that transcends contracts and surnames, fortunes and appearances. That night, between whispers and caresses, they made love for the first time, not as part of a marital obligation, not as fulfillment of social expectations, but as the natural and spontaneous expression of a feeling that had blossomed against all odds in the most unlikely terrain. The days following the company's fall passed in a strange emotional limbo. Michael oscillated between moments of liberation, as if he had taken an unbearable weight off his shoulders, and episodes of deep despair where he questioned every decision he had made in his life. Emily observed him traverse these emotional tides, offering her constant presence without trying to rush him in his grieving process. On a particularly cold November morning, Michael disappeared. Emily woke up alone in bed with a terse note on the pillow. Need time to think. We'll return tonight. Don't worry. But it was impossible not to worry. He had never left like this before, without explanations, without a goodbye kiss. The hours dragged with an exasperating slowness. Emily tried to distract herself in the garden, but the cold and persistent drizzle forced her to take refuge inside. She wandered through the mansion they would soon have to leave behind, observing each corner with new eyes. What would they take? What would they leave behind? What part of their lives together was inextricably linked to these spaces? At dusk, when anxiety began to transform into real fear, she heard the sound of the front door. Michael entered, soaked by the rain, with the appearance of a man who had walked for hours without a fixed destination. His eyes, however, showed a clarity they hadn't had in days. "I thought you weren't coming back," she confessed, embracing him without caring that he was getting her wet. "I thought so too for a moment," he admitted, and the raw honesty of those words made her shudder. "I was at the edge of the abyss today, Emily." He led her to the living room, and they sat together in front of the fireplace that Emily had lit hours before. With still trembling hands, Michael began to tell her about his day, his pilgrimage to the significant places of his life in New York. "I went to the office one last time. I collected my things, 20 years of my life in 3 cardboard boxes." His voice sounded distant, as if he were describing someone else's life. "Then I went to the cemetery to my father's grave." Emily remained silent, understanding the importance of that gesture. Michael never talked about his father, the severe man who had founded the empire that was now crumbling. "I always sought his approval, even after he died," he continued. "Every decision, every achievement, every acquisition, everything was to prove to him that I was worthy of being his son, of bearing his surname. And now, losing everything, I felt I had definitively failed him." Emily took his hand, offering him an anchor amid the emotional storm. "But then, while I was there, in the rain, talking to a cold marble tombstone, I realized something." His voice broke. "I realized I never had his approval in life, and I never will. And that I've wasted decades chasing a ghost, trying to please a man who never knew how to love." Tears now ran freely down his face, mixing with the raindrops that hadn't yet dried. "Afterwards, I walked to Central Park. I contemplated the lake for hours, thinking how easy it would be to simply disappear," he confessed in a barely audible whisper. "Leave everything behind. The shame, the failure, the feeling of not being enough." Emily felt her heart stop at the mere idea of losing him like that. "What stopped you?" she asked, her voice trembling with retrospective fear. Michael looked at her then, with an intensity that took her breath away. "You," he answered simply. "Your image appeared in my mind. I thought about how you would feel, how you would blame yourself. I thought I would never see your smile at dawn again, or hear your stories about the orchards of your childhood. I thought about our garden, about the seeds we planted together that I would never see bloom." He moved closer to her, taking her face in his hands with infinite tenderness. "I realized that for the first time in my life, I have something more valuable than success, than approval, than family legacy. I have you, Emily. And that changes everything." That night, embraced in front of the crackling fire, they shared their deepest fears, their most ingrained insecurities. Emily told him about her own abysses, the terror of not being enough for him, that one day he would wake up and realize he had made a mistake by marrying a simple rural teacher without refinement or connections. "Do you know what's most ironic?" said Michael, caressing her hair tenderly. "That I had the same fear. That one day you would see beyond the money and power and discover there's nothing more, that I'm just a broken man trying to hold the pieces together." Emily sat up, looking at him with a mixture of wonder and compassion. "But that's exactly what I love about you," she confessed. "Not the infallible businessman, but the man who fights with his demons, who doubts, who breaks and puts himself back together. The man who plants tomatoes with me on Saturdays and still can't tell the difference between rosemary and thyme." Michael laughed through tears, and the sound of that sincere laugh was like a ray of sunlight breaking through the darkest clouds. "I love you, Emily," he said for the first time, with a clarity and certainty born precisely from having hit rock bottom. "Not for what you do for me or how you make me feel, but for who you are in your most authentic and beautiful essence." "I love you too, Michael," she replied, with the deep simplicity that had always been her greatest strength. "And together we'll find the way back, step by step." In that moment, as rain beat against the windows of the mansion they would soon leave behind, both understood they had found something many search for a lifetime without achieving, a love that transcends circumstances, that doesn't depend on fortune or social position, but on the conscious and daily decision to choose each other, with all the imperfections and wounds that made them human. December arrived with unusual cold for New York and the inevitable deadline. They had until the end of the month to leave the mansion that had been their home for nearly 2 years. Emily observed how the rooms were gradually emptying, each packed object representing a fragment of the life they had shared between those walls. The most painful part was the garden. That space they had created together, planting each seed, designing each path, now had to be left behind. On a particularly cold morning, Emily was kneeling beside her rose bushes, whispering a farewell that no one else could hear. "I promised I would take care of you," she said, when she felt Michael's presence behind her. "I feel like I'm failing you." He knelt beside her, taking a handful of earth between his fingers, letting it slide slowly back to the ground. "Maybe we can take some cuttings," he suggested. "A small piece of this garden to start the next one." Emily looked at him with infinite gratitude for understanding what that space meant to her, to them both. It wasn't just a garden, but the tangible symbol of how they had built something beautiful together, from scratch with patience and dedication. The last days in the mansion were marked by unexpected visits. The first to appear was Mrs. Anderson, impeccably dressed as always, her usual expression of superiority slightly tempered by what seemed to be genuine concern. "Son, I've come to offer my help," she declared as soon as she entered, almost completely ignoring Emily. "I understand you must leave the house. You can move into the apartment in Brooklyn that your father bought years ago. It's not what you're accustomed to, but at least it's worthy of the Anderson name." Michael exchanged a quick glance with Emily before responding with a firmness that surprised even her. "I appreciate it, Mother, but we've already found a place, a small house in Martha's Vineyard near the sea. It's modest, but it's what we want." Mrs. Anderson couldn't disguise her disapproval. "Martha's Vineyard? It's too provincial." "What will our acquaintances say?" "Frankly, Mother, I no longer care what they say," Michael replied with a tranquility that disarmed the woman. "I've spent 45 years trying to please others. It's time to live on my own terms." The matriarch then turned to Emily, evaluating her with new eyes. "This is your influence, I suppose," she said, but her tone lacked its usual hostility. "Actually, the decision was both of ours," Emily interjected with serenity. "We want a new beginning, in a place without painful memories." To everyone's surprise, Mrs. Anderson nodded slowly, as if for the first time she were really listening. "Perhaps you have more common sense than I initially attributed to you," she conceded, which, coming from her, was equivalent to a significant compliment. Michael was always too much like his father, obsessed with success at any price. "Perhaps." She left the phrase unfinished, but her eyes reflected a reluctant respect. As she was leaving, she paused briefly beside Emily and whispered something only she could hear. "Take care of him. He's more fragile than he appears." The second visit was even more unexpected. Alexander Monroe, the mentor and subsequently traitor who had voted against Michael on the board of directors, appeared one afternoon at the mansion door. Michael was about to immediately send him away, but Emily asked with a look to grant him a few minutes. "I know I have no right to be here," Alexander began, his face marked by evident guilt. "What I did has no justification." "Then why have you come?" asked Michael, his fists clenched in restraint. "Because I needed you to know the truth," replied the older man, taking an envelope from his jacket. "They threatened me, Michael. Mark had information about irregularities I committed years ago, before you entered the company. He used that to force me to vote against you." He handed him the envelope with trembling hands. "Here's everything. The evidence of the extortion, documents that directly incriminate Mark for fund diversion. I've already delivered them to the prosecutor, but I wanted you to see them first." Michael looked at the envelope without taking it, with an indecipherable expression. "Why now? Why not before I lost everything?" "Because I'm a coward," Alexander admitted with brutal honesty. "Because I feared public shame more than betraying the man I consider a son. and I will regret it until the last day of my life." Emily observed the exchange, holding her breath, aware that this moment could define Michael's future as much as the loss of the company. She saw the internal struggle reflected in his face, the anger, the pain of betrayal, but also the memory of years of mentorship and genuine friendship. Finally, Michael took the envelope. "I can't forgive you. Not now," he said in a controlled voice. "But I appreciate your honesty, even if it comes late." When Alexander left, with his shoulders slumped by the weight of his actions, Michael stared at the envelope for a long time. "What will you do?" Emily asked softly. "I don't know," he confessed. "I could use this to bring Mark to justice, perhaps even recover some of what was lost. But it would mean months, maybe years, of legal battles, constantly reliving this nightmare." Emily approached, resting her head on his shoulder. "Whatever decision you make, I'll be by your side," she assured him. "Just ask yourself, what will bring you more peace?" The night before definitively leaving the mansion, they performed a small, improvised ritual. They went through each room, remembering significant moments experienced in them. Their first shared breakfast on the terrace, the first time Emily cooked and almost set the kitchen on fire, the night Michael taught her to dance the waltz in the living room. Upon reaching the garden under a winter starry sky, Michael took from his pocket the envelope Alexander had given him. "I've made a decision," he announced. "I'll hand this to the attorney to proceed legally against Mark. Not for revenge, but for justice, and afterward I'll close this chapter definitively." Emily nodded, understanding the importance of this symbolic act. "And the company? If the evidence is solid, you could regain control." "No," he interrupted with surprising serenity. "Even if it were possible, I don't want to go back. That life is no longer who I am. Or perhaps it never really was." They took a small gardening trowel and together dug a small hole at the foot of the oldest rosebush, the first they had planted. They deposited there a paper where they had written all the wounds, fears, and resentments they wanted to leave behind. Then they covered it with earth and planted a small lavender cutting on top. "So that something beautiful grows from what we let go," Emily explained, with silent tears rolling down her cheeks. That night, their last in the mansion, they made love with an intensity born from the certainty that, despite leaving behind an important chapter of their lives, they carried with them the only truly essential thing, the love that had blossomed between them against all odds, stronger precisely because of the storms it had survived. The house in Martha's Vineyard was as different from the New York mansion as could be imagined. A New England colonial construction of 2 stories, with white walls and blue shutters, surrounded by a modest plot where vegetation grew almost with festive abandon. From the small porch, the sea could be seen in the distance, a blue canvas that changed shades according to the time of day and the whim of the sky. On the first day in their new home, Emily woke at dawn, disoriented for a moment. The light came in differently. The sounds were new, seagulls instead of urban traffic, the distant murmur of waves instead of occasional sirens. Beside her, Michael slept deeply for the first time in months, with an expression of peace she had rarely seen on his face. She rose without making a noise and went down to the small kitchen, where the moving boxes still waited to be unpacked. She found the essentials to prepare coffee and went out to the porch to contemplate their new surroundings in the day's first light. The garden, or what would be a garden when they could transform it, was wild and neglected, but Emily saw the potential in every corner. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Michael's voice surprised her. He was leaning against the doorframe, with tousled hair and a relaxed expression that made him look years younger. "It's perfect," she replied, offering him a cup of coffee. "Different, but perfect." They sat together on the porch steps, contemplating the sunrise in silence, letting the reality of their new life gradually settle in. "You know, when I was a child, I always wanted to live near the sea," Michael confessed. "I dreamed of being a sailor, exploring the world. My father laughed at me when I told him. He said the Andersons weren't sea people, but builders of terrestrial empires." Emily took his hand, imagining the sensitive child beneath the layers of the businessman the world knew. "It's never too late to recover lost dreams," she said softly. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity, the move, the adaptation to a smaller but infinitely more welcoming space, the discovery of the town and its rhythms. To the surprise of both, the transition proved simpler than they had anticipated. There was something liberating about leaving behind ostentatious luxury, about learning to live with less but more consciously. Michael had received a modest settlement from the company, enough to live comfortably for a while as he decided which direction to take. Emily, for her part, had secured an interview at the local school for the next academic year. One morning, while having breakfast on their usual spot on the porch, a ritual they had maintained since New York, Michael set his cup on the table with a decisive gesture. "I've been thinking," he began, with an unusual timidity for him. "Remember I told you about my passion for architecture?" Emily nodded, intrigued by the direction the conversation was taking. "Yesterday I was at the town bookstore and bought this," he continued, showing her a sketchbook and a case of professional quality pencils. "I've decided to take it up again. Not as a profession, it's too late for that, but as a reconnection with a part of myself I abandoned." The joy on Emily's face was all the approval he needed. "And there's something else," he added, taking an envelope from his shirt pocket. "I received news from the prosecutor's office. The evidence against Mark was compelling. He's being prosecuted for corporate fraud and embezzlement. I won't recover the company, but at least there will be justice." Emily hugged him tightly, understanding what this closure meant to him. "How do you feel?" she asked, searching in his eyes for any trace of the bitterness that had been his constant companion during the past months. "At peace," he replied simply. "For the first time in many years, truly at peace." That afternoon, while Emily prepared the ground for what would be their new garden, Michael sat under an old apple tree. Coincidence or destiny that there was one so similar to the one in her family farm in Virginia, and began to draw. First uncertain strokes, then increasingly fluid ones, rediscovering a skill that had been dormant but not lost. The days acquired their own rhythm, marked by small rituals that were building their new reality. Shared breakfasts watching the sunrise, walks on the beach at sunset, dinners prepared together in the small kitchen while listening to music. Michael discovered the pleasure of cooking, something he had never done in his previous life. Emily found a book club at the local library that welcomed her with enthusiasm. One March afternoon, when spring was beginning to hint in the warmer air and the first sprouts in their newly planted garden, they received a surprise visit. Mrs. Anderson appeared at their door, alone and visibly uncomfortable in that environment she would consider too rustic. "Mother," Michael greeted, unable to hide his astonishment. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to find myself here either," she replied, with her characteristic frankness. "But there are matters that can't be discussed over the phone." They invited her in and offered her tea in the small living room, where Michael's architectural drawings now decorated the walls. Mrs. Anderson observed them attentively, perhaps recognizing for the first time a talent in her son that she had never properly valued. "The reason for my visit," she began formally, "is to inform you that the process against Mark Wilson is proceeding favorably. The family attorneys believe you will be able to recover significant compensation for the damages caused." "Thank you for the information," Michael replied cordially, "but I'm no longer following the case closely. I've decided to look forward, not backward." Mrs. Anderson observed him as if seeing a stranger. "I've never seen you like this," she finally commented. "There's something different about you." "I am different," he confirmed with simplicity. "Or perhaps for the first time I am who I always should have been." An uncomfortable silence settled between them until, to the surprise of both, Emily decided to intervene. "Would you like to see our garden, Mrs. Anderson? It's just beginning, but we have big plans for it." The proposal seemed so out of place that for a moment no one reacted. Then, to Michael's absolute astonishment, his mother nodded. "I'd like to see what you're creating here," she accepted with a dignity that seemed out of place among clay pots and gardening tools. For the next hour, Emily guided her mother-in-law through the grounds, explaining with genuine enthusiasm each plant, each future project. Michael followed at a distance, marveled at the strange complicity that seemed to be developing between the two most important women in his life. When Mrs. Anderson was leaving, she paused briefly beside her son, and in an unusual gesture took his hand in hers. "Your father would be bewildered," she said, with brutal frankness. "But I am beginning to understand. It's not the life I imagined for you, but you seem complete." It was the closest thing to a blessing he would ever receive from her, and Michael accepted it with a serene smile. "I am, Mother. I truly am." That night, as they contemplated the stars from their small porch, Emily noticed that Michael seemed especially thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, leaning against his chest. "About how sometimes we have to lose everything to find what really matters," he replied, caressing her hair tenderly. "About how an agreement of convenience can transform into the most authentic love I ever imagined possible." Emily raised her gaze to him, her eyes bright with contained emotion. "Do you regret anything?" she asked in a whisper. "Only not having found you sooner," he replied with absolute sincerity. "All the years I spent chasing ghosts instead of something real." Under the starry sky of Martha's Vineyard, with the murmur of the sea as background music, they sealed that confession with a kiss that tasted of fulfilled promises and futures to build together, step by step, day by day, as they had built their garden, with patience, dedication, and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely terrain. Spring in Martha's Vineyard exploded in a symphony of colors and scents that completely transformed their little corner of the world. The garden Emily had carefully designed was beginning to take shape, with the first flowers opening their petals to the New England sun and the aromatic herbs perfuming the air with each breeze. Michael had established his drawing studio in a small room overlooking the sea. The walls were covered with sketches, some of imaginary buildings that combined functionality and beauty, others of corners of their new home, many of Emily at different times of day, reading on the porch, working in the garden, asleep with the dawn light caressing her face. One April morning, while having breakfast at their usual spot on the porch, Emily handed him an envelope. "It's official," she announced with a radiant smile. "They've offered me the position at the school for the next academic year. I'll be teaching again in September." Michael embraced her with genuine joy. He knew how much she had missed the classrooms, the children's voices, the sense of contributing to something meaningful. "We should celebrate," he proposed, kissing her forehead. "A special dinner tonight." But Emily seemed slightly distracted, as if something else occupied her thoughts. "Is there something else you want to tell me?" he asked, already knowing the small gestures that revealed her concerns. She hesitated a moment, nibbling her lower lip in a gesture Michael had learned to associate with nervousness. "Actually, yes, there is something else I wanted to discuss with you," she finally confessed. "I've been thinking about our future." "I'm listening," he replied, intrigued by the sudden seriousness. "When we married, we talked about having children someday," she began, carefully choosing her words. "It was part of the original agreement, although we both know our marriage has become something completely different from what we planned." Michael nodded, remembering those initial conversations, cold and calculated like business negotiations. "I was wondering if it's still something you desire," she continued, with a vulnerability in her voice that deeply moved him. "Forming a family now that our relationship is real, based on love and not a contract." The question caught him by surprise, not because he hadn't thought about it, but because he hadn't expected Emily to propose it at that moment, when their lives were just beginning to stabilize after so many changes. "Do you want that?" he asked gently, seeking her gaze. "Yes," she replied with simplicity, "but only if it's something we share. I don't want it to be like before, an obligation or an expectation. I want it to be a decision made from love, from the genuine desire to create life together." Michael remained silent for a few moments, processing his emotions. The idea of fatherhood had always been present in his life as a dynastic obligation, a need to perpetuate the surname and ensure the business succession. He had never allowed himself to consider it from another perspective. "I'm afraid," he finally confessed, with an honesty that only Emily had come to know. "My father wasn't exactly a role model, and I don't know if I would know how to be the kind of father a child deserves." Emily took his hands in hers, with infinite tenderness. "The simple fact that you worry about that already makes you different from your father," she pointed out. "Besides, you wouldn't be alone. We would do it together, like everything else." That conversation marked the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship. They didn't make an immediate decision, but agreed to give themselves time to reflect, to feel if it was the right path for both of them. But the seed had been planted, and like everything they cultivated together, it began to take root silently. The following weeks brought unexpected changes. One day, Michael received a call from Alexander Monroe, his former mentor. "There's something you should know," said the older man, with a tone that mixed enthusiasm and caution. The board of directors is in crisis. The new owners have proven to be completely incompetent. Stocks have plummeted. And why should that matter to me? Asked Michael, feeling a distant echo of the pain those memories still provoked. Because there's a possibility of regaining control, Alexander explained. A group of minority shareholders, including myself, is gathering funds for a buyout offer. We want you to return as president. Michael felt the ground move beneath his feet. It was the opportunity to recover everything he had lost, to vindicate his name, to prove that he had been right from the beginning. It was everything he would have desperately desired just a few months ago. I need to think about it, he replied, without committing. I'll call you tomorrow. When he shared the news with Emily that night as they prepared dinner together in their small kitchen, she listened attentively without interrupting. What do you think? He finally asked, genuinely interested in her opinion. I think the real question is, what do you think? She responded wisely. Is this what you really want? Would returning to that life make you happy? Michael paused, the knife suspended over the vegetables he was cutting. 6 months ago I would have said yes without hesitation, he admitted. Now, I'm not sure. There are days when I don't miss any of that. The endless meetings, the constant pressure, the sleepless nights over concerns that now seem so artificial. They went out to the porch after dinner, sharing a glass of wine under the starry sky they had never been able to truly appreciate in New York, with all the light pollution of the city. If you decide to go back, said Emily, breaking the contemplative silence, I'll support you. And if you decide that this new path is what you prefer, I'll also be by your side. I just want you to choose what makes you genuinely happy. Michael looked at her with infinite amazement and gratitude, aware of the rarity of such selfless love, so free of conditions. You know what's strangest, he said, intertwining his fingers with hers. That for the first time in my life, professional success is not what defines my happiness. There's something much more valuable that I've found here, with you. The decision wasn't immediate or easy. Michael spent days considering all the implications, weighing the pros and cons. He consulted with Emily every step of the way, valuing her perspective which, free from the binds of the corporate world, saw nuances he overlooked. Finally, one May afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, planting a small lemon tree they had chosen at the local nursery, Michael reached his conclusion. I've decided to accept the offer, he said, as he carefully secured the tree in the ground. But with my conditions. Emily looked at him expectantly, her hands full of fertile soil. I won't return full-time or move back to New York, he explained. I'll be a strategic advisor, help restructure the company but maintain my independence. I'll work mainly from here, traveling to the city only when strictly necessary. A smile of understanding illuminated Emily's face. You've found the balance, she observed. I hope so, he replied, contemplating his hands that now knew both the touch of corporate documents and that of moist earth. I want to contribute with my experience, help save the jobs of people who trusted me for years, but not at the cost of what we've built here. He sealed that promise by firmly planting the lemon tree, a symbol of new roots and fruits to come. That night, as they lay together under the fresh sheets, with the window open letting in the sea breeze and the distant sound of waves, Michael made one more decision. About our earlier conversation, about forming a family, he whispered, caressing Emily's face in the dimness. It's something I want to share with you. Not out of obligation, not to continue any lineage, but because I love you and because I can't imagine a more beautiful adventure than creating life with you. Emily's eyes shone with contained tears as she approached to kiss him, sealing a promise that transcended any contract or previous agreement. It was a promise born of the most authentic love, of the conscious and daily choice to build something meaningful together. Under the starry sky of Martha's vineyard, with the murmur of the sea as witness, what had begun as a cold marital arrangement culminated in the warmest of rebirths, that of two souls who had found in each other not just a life companion, but also a home. Summer brought a humid heat that enveloped Martha's vineyard like a warm blanket, slowing the rhythm of the small coastal town until it became a poem to pause and contemplation. For Emily and Michael, those months marked a period of transition and adaptation to their new circumstances. Michael had begun his new role as a strategic advisor to the company, working mainly from home and traveling to New York only 2 days a week. This new balance allowed him to keep one foot in the corporate world that had been his life for so many years, while cultivating this new path with Emily. One hot July afternoon, as Emily returned from the market with bags full of fresh vegetables and seasonal fruits, she found Michael sitting on the porch with an indecipherable expression on his face. Beside him, on the wooden table weathered by sun and sea breeze, was an opened envelope. "Has something happened?" she asked, setting the bags on the ground and approaching with concern. Michael raised his gaze, and his eyes reflected a mixture of emotions that Emily couldn't immediately interpret. Surprise, confusion, perhaps even fear. "I received the results of my medical tests," he replied in a controlled voice. "The ones I had done last week, as part of the process we agreed on before trying to form a family." Emily's heart skipped a beat. They had decided they would both undergo complete checkups before trying to conceive, a practical decision made with the serenity of those planning a future together. "And?" she asked, feeling her hands beginning to tremble slightly. Michael took a deep breath before responding. "Physically, I'm fine, but they found something unexpected." He handed her the envelope with the results. Emily read quickly, trying to understand the medical terminology, until her eyes stopped on an underlined paragraph. "Hormone levels consistent with a condition of significant subfertility. Probability of natural conception extremely reduced." "The doctor says it's probably congenital," Michael explained in a monotone voice, as if he were discussing a business report and not something so deeply personal. "That I've always had this condition without knowing it." Emily sat next to him, processing the information and its implications. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly, taking his hand in hers. Michael took several moments to respond, as if organizing a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. "I'm thinking about the irony," he finally said, "about how my father obsessed all his life with legacy, with the continuity of the Anderson name, about how I married you initially, with the expectation of having heirs, and now it turns out I might never have been able to have them, regardless of who I married." There was such a deep vulnerability in his confession that Emily felt her heart constrict for him. "Michael, this doesn't change anything fundamental between us," she assured, squeezing his hand firmly. "There are options, alternative paths, if we really want to be parents." "I know," he replied with a sad smile. "But I need time to process this, to reconcile myself with this new truth about myself." That night, as they dined in silence in the small kitchen, with the sound of waves as their only accompaniment, Michael seemed lost in his thoughts. Emily respected that space, understanding that some internal battles must be fought in solitude before they can be shared. It was almost midnight when he finally spoke, as they contemplated the stars from the porch, a custom that had become a ritual since they moved to Martha's vineyard. "All my life I've been trying to meet expectations," he began, with a soft but firm voice. "My father's, society's, those I imposed on myself, and every time I failed to reach them, I felt something was fundamentally wrong with me." Emily listened in silence, offering the gift of her complete attention. "Today, when I read those results, my first thought was, I failed again," he confessed with brutal honesty, as if my very body had betrayed the legacy I was supposed to continue. "Michael," she began, but he gently stopped her. "Let me finish, please," he asked, "because what came afterward was a revelation. While I walked alone on the beach this afternoon, thinking about all this, I realized something fundamental. I'm tired of living chasing expectations, of feeling defective for not fulfilling predetermined roles." He turned to her, taking her face in his hands with moving intensity. "What we have, Emily, is real. It's true, and it doesn't depend on any external expectation, on any legacy to continue. It's valuable in itself here and now." Emily felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, understanding the depth of the transformation Michael was experiencing. "If we can have children, however it happens, we'll love them with all our hearts," he continued. "And if it's not possible, our life will continue to be full and meaningful. Because what matters is what we build together, not what others expect us to be." That night, embraced in the darkness of their bedroom, with the sea breeze caressing their faces through the open window, they experienced a deeper intimacy than any physical union. It was the intimacy that is born from shared vulnerability, from total acceptance, from love that transcends expectations and embraces imperfect human reality. The following days brought honest conversations about the future, about the available options, about what they really desired as a couple. They researched possibilities, fertility treatments, adoption, lives centered on other types of legacies. One afternoon, while they worked together in the garden, he pruning the roses, she sowing aromatic herbs, Emily made an observation that would change the direction of their reflections. "Do you know what I love about you as a teacher?" she asked, apparently changing the subject. "Teacher," he replied, bewildered. "I've never taught anything." "Not formally," she smiled. "But I've seen you explaining architecture concepts to Ethan, our neighbor's son, when he comes to see your drawings. The patience you have, the way you adapt complex explanations so he can understand. You're a natural teacher, Michael." He stood still, as if an idea had just hit him with the force of a revelation. "I've never thought of it that way," he confessed, with an expression of wonder. "I always assumed my only possible legacy would be through biological children or the business empire. But there are so many ways to leave a mark, aren't there? So many ways to nurture the future." That conversation planted a seed that would grow in the following months. Michael began to explore the possibility of teaching, of sharing his experience and knowledge. He contacted a design school in Boston and offered to give occasional talks on the intersection between architecture and sustainable business. By the end of summer, when the heat was beginning to subside and the first autumn breezes refreshed the afternoons, they reached a decision as a couple. They would remain open to all possibilities of forming a family, without pressures or deadlines, while building a meaningful life based on sharing what they had to offer. On the morning of the first anniversary of their move to Martha's Vineyard, Michael woke before dawn. Careful not to wake Emily, he went down silently to his studio and took a sketchbook. For hours he worked on a drawing that had been forming in his mind for weeks. When Emily came down, sleepy and wrapped in one of his old shirts she used as a robe, she found him completely absorbed in his work. "What are you drawing with such concentration?" she asked, kissing his head from behind. Michael showed her the sketch, a detailed design to transform the back of their garden into an educational space, with a small greenhouse, work areas for different ages, and a cozy corner for readings and conversations. "It's for the neighborhood children," he explained with enthusiasm. "We could offer workshops, you teaching about plants and nature, me about design and construction. A space where they can learn, create, connect with the earth." Emily observed the design and then Michael's illuminated face, understanding that she was witnessing the birth of something deeply meaningful. "It's perfect," she whispered, with tears of joy in her eyes. "It's exactly the type of legacy we can build together." In that moment, under the golden light of dawn that flooded the small studio overlooking the sea, both felt with absolute clarity that they had found their path. It wasn't what they had initially planned. It didn't follow the expectations that others had placed on them, but it was authentically theirs. And in that authenticity lay its greatest beauty and value. Michael stood and embraced Emily with an intensity that expressed everything words couldn't contain: gratitude for having found her, for the shared journey, for the courage to abandon pre-established paths to forge their own, together. "I love you," he whispered against her hair, "not for what we may be or have in the future, but for what we are here and now." "I love you too," she replied, with the deep simplicity that had always been her greatest strength. "For who you are, for who you help me to be." And so at the climax of their shared story, what had begun as a cold agreement between strangers culminated in the warmest of revelations, that the true purpose, the true legacy, is not found in fulfilling others' expectations, but in having the courage to create something authentic and valuable with the imperfect but precious lives we have been given. 2 years later, the backyard of the house in Martha's Vineyard bustled with activity that sunny Saturday morning. Children of various ages moved between the work tables, some planting seeds in small clay pots, others drawing simple plans under Michael's patient guidance. Emily moved among them like a butterfly, stopping here and there to offer a word of encouragement, gently correct a mistake, celebrate an achievement. The Garden of Encounters, as they had decided to call it, had become an informal institution in the neighborhood. Each Saturday, the doors opened for any child who wanted to learn about nature, architecture, the art of creating with their hands. There were no fees or requirements, just the shared commitment to respect the space and others. From a corner of the porch, Mrs. Anderson observed the scene with an expression that mixed bewilderment and something akin to admiration. Her visits, initially sporadic and tense, had become more frequent over time. She would never openly admit it, but she found a strange peace in that place, so different from the refined environments she had frequented all her life. "I never thought I'd see my son covered in mud and perfectly happy about it," she commented when Emily approached to offer her fresh lemonade. "Life has surprising ways of leading us exactly where we need to be," Emily replied with a tranquil smile. "Even if it's not where we plan to go." The older woman nodded slightly, as if that simple truth resonated with something deep within her. "Michael told me about the girl," she said after a moment, with a carefully neutral tone. "The one you're considering adopting." Emily followed her mother-in-law's gaze to the other end of the garden, where a girl of about 6, with dark braids and vivacious eyes, was helping Michael build a small structure with wooden blocks. "Lily," Emily confirmed. "She's been in 3 different foster homes. She's brilliant, creative, and has an enormous heart. She started coming to the workshop 6 months ago and—" She paused, searching for the right words. "We connected with her in a special way." Mrs. Anderson attentively observed the interaction between her son and the little girl. There was a naturalness in their way of communicating, an evident connection that transcended blood or surnames. "She would be my first grandchild," she finally said, with a vulnerability Emily had never perceived in her. "She would," Emily softly confirmed, "if we decide to move forward and if she also chooses us." The older woman looked at her with surprise. "If she chooses you?" she asked, bewildered. "Lily has lost too much in her short life for others to decide for her again," Emily explained firmly. "If this step happens, it will be a mutual decision, based on love and respect, not on others' needs or expectations." Mrs. Anderson remained silent for a few moments, processing those words that challenged everything she had been taught about family and legacy. "You are an extraordinary woman, Emily," she finally said, with a sincerity that surprised them both. "My son had the wisdom or fortune to find you, and I will never stop being grateful for that." On the other side of the garden, Michael observed the scene with amazement, his mother and his wife, conversing as equals, sharing something that seemed to transcend the differences that had initially separated them. It was one more of the small miracles that occurred daily in that space they had created together. "Michael," Lily's voice brought him back to the present, "do you think I could be an architect like you when I grow up?" He looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and respect that he reserved for truly important conversations. "I believe you can be whatever your heart desires, Lily," he replied, with absolute sincerity. "The only important thing is that it's your choice, not what others expect of you." The girl nodded gravely, as if she had just received a fundamental truth she would keep forever. The workshop ended at noon, with the children proudly taking their creations and the promise to return the following week. When the last little one left, accompanied by grateful parents, the house remained in a welcoming silence, punctuated only by the birds singing and the distant murmur of the sea. Emily, Michael, and Mrs. Anderson shared a simple but delicious lunch on the porch, with products from the small vegetable garden they had cultivated together. The conversation flowed with a naturalness that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago, touching on topics ranging from future plans for the educational garden to Michael's progress with his classes at the Boston Design School. When Mrs. Anderson said goodbye that afternoon, she embraced Emily with a genuine warmth that sealed a hard-won reconciliation. Then she approached her son and, in an unusual gesture, took his face in her hands. "Your father was wrong about many things," she said in a clear voice, "and so was I. I hope you can forgive us both for not having seen the extraordinary man you are before." After her departure, Emily and Michael walked together to the small orchard they had planted at the end of the garden, inspired by the memories of her childhood in Virginia. The central tree, the first they had planted, was beginning to bear fruit, small apples that promised a modest but significant first harvest. "Do you know what day it is today?" asked Michael, circling Emily's waist with his arms as they contemplated their shared creation. "Our wedding anniversary," she replied, leaning against his chest. 3 years since that day in the New York cathedral, surrounded by strangers. 3 years since we signed a contract that intended to define our future," he added, gently kissing her hair. "And look where we are now." They turned to contemplate their home, the garden they had created from scratch, the educational space they generously shared with the community. A life so different from what either would have imagined, and yet infinitely richer and more meaningful. "Do you regret anything?" asked Emily, a question they had asked many times throughout their shared journey. "Only not having found the courage to be authentic sooner," he replied, with the honesty that had become the pillar of their relationship. "But even that I wouldn't change, because each step, each mistake, each fear overcome brought us exactly here, to this perfect moment." The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, bathing the garden in a golden light that transformed the everyday into magical. Michael took Emily's hand and led her to a small bench they had built together under the central apple tree. "I have something for you," he said, taking a small package from his shirt pocket. Emily opened it with curiosity, finding a delicate silver ring with inlays of small green stones that recalled the color of her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered, moved. "3 years ago I gave you a ring that symbolized a contract," explained Michael, taking the ring and sliding it gently onto her finger. "Today I want to give you one that symbolizes a choice. My daily choice to love you, not for what you represent or for what you can give me, but for who you are in your most authentic and beautiful essence." Emily felt tears flowing freely, without trying to contain them. They were tears of gratitude, of joy, of wonder, at the everyday miracle of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely terrain. "My grandmother Grace used to say that true love isn't what withstands great storms," she said, her voice broken with emotion, "but what blooms in the small moments of everyday life, in hands that find each other without seeking, in gazes that recognize each other in a crowd." She took from her own pocket a small object wrapped in an embroidered handkerchief. "I also have something for you," she confessed, unfolding the handkerchief to reveal an apple seed perfectly preserved. "It's from that century-old tree on my family's farm, the one I showed you the first time we visited Virginia together. I want us to plant it here, as a symbol that our roots are now intertwined, growing together toward the future." In the heart of their shared garden, under the waning light of that anniversary day, they planted the seed together, their hands joined in the fertile earth, in a gesture so simple and yet so deeply symbolic of all they had built together. "To many more years of daily choices," whispered Michael, gently kissing her lips. "To a love that blooms in small moments," she replied, closing her eyes to fully savor the perfection of that instant. And so, as the sun set on the sea horizon, what had begun as a cold marital agreement reached its culmination in the warmest of certainties. That true love is not born from contracts or expectations, but from the courage to show ourselves vulnerable, from the conscious decision to choose each other every day, and from the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead exactly where our hearts needed to arrive.